The wind in the Arizona territory has a voice. On most days, it whispers secrets of sun-scorched earth and forgotten canyons. But on the first day of the Great Blizzard of '88, it screamed. For Willa Hayes, a widow trapped in a cabin her husband had built with his own 2 hands, that scream was the only company she had. The world had shrunk to 4 log walls and the ghost of a man she'd buried a year prior. But out in the blinding white, a different kind of ghost was fighting to be heard. A sound that would cleave her life in 2. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the shriek of the wind. It was the frail, desperate scream of a baby, a cry that would force her to choose between the safety of her solitude and the soul of the West itself. The blizzard did not arrive. It materialized. One moment, the sky over the Dragoon Mountains was the color of a bruised plum, a silent, ominous warning. The next, the world dissolved into a churning vortex of white. Willa Hayes watched from her small window as the familiar shapes of her homestead, the sturdy corral, the lone skeletal cottonwood, the path to the well were devoured by the storm. It had been a year since she'd buried her husband, Thomas. He had been a strong man, a man who seemed to understand the rhythms of this harsh land, his silence as deep and steady as the mountains themselves. He had built this cabin with an axe and his own stubborn will, promising her a life carved from the wilderness. Then a rattlesnake coiled in the woodpile had turned that promise to dust. Now Willa was the one who had to be stubborn. Leaving would mean admitting defeat, not just to the land, but to the crushing weight of her grief. So she stayed a solitary woman, clinging to the edge of the known world. The first day of the blizzard was a battle of attrition. She reinforced the door with Thomas's heavy tool chest stuffed rags into the chinks in the log walls, and kept the fire in the stone hearth roaring, feeding it the precious wood Thomas had spent a summer chopping. The wind was a physical presence, a malevolent entity trying to tear its way inside. It clawed at the roof, rattled the single glass pane, and screamed down the chimney, making the flames dance like panicked spirits. By the second day, the world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the white fury and the groaning of the cabin's timbers. Willa's routine became primal: feed the fire melt snow for water check on her dwindling food supplies. The isolation was a heavy blanket, suffocating her with memories of Thomas's laughter and the phantom scent of his tobacco. She found herself talking to him, her voice hoarse in the roaring silence. "You'd know what to do, Thomas," she murmured, staring into the fire. "You'd just hitch your trousers and face it down. I'm not sure I'm strong enough." It was on the evening of the 3rd day that she heard it. At first she thought it was a trick of the wind, another voice in its hellish chorus, a thin, high-pitched wail that seemed to pierce through the storm's deep bass drone. She froze her hand halfway to the log basket. She held her breath, listening. The wind shrieked, and for a moment there was nothing. Delirium, she thought. The loneliness is finally breaking me. But then it came again, closer this time, impossibly close. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated misery. A baby's cry. Willa's heart hammered against her ribs. It couldn't be. The nearest homestead was a day's ride east. The town of Prosperity was 2 days west. No one could be out in this, no living thing. She scrambled to the door, her mind racing. A mountain lion. A coyote pup. But the sound was distinctly, terrifyingly human. Hesitantly, she pulled the heavy tool chest away. The wind blasted the door open, slamming it against the interior wall, and sucking the warmth from the cabin in a greedy gasp. A tidal wave of snow and ice crystals poured into the room, blinding her. "Hello," she screamed into the white chaos, her voice instantly snatched away. She wrapped Thomas's thickest wool coat around herself, pulled on his gloves, and tied a scarf over her face, leaving only her eyes exposed. Taking the storm lantern from its hook, she lit the wick. Its small, flickering flame was a pathetic insult to the tempest, but it was all she had. She stepped outside, and the storm hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and trying to tear the lanternmas from her shrapnel. The world was a formless, roaring void. She couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of her. The snow was already up to her thighs, a treacherous, shifting sea. The cry came again to her left, somewhere near the snow-buried fence line. Driven by an instinct she didn't know she possessed, she waded into the blizzard. Each step was a monumental effort. The cold was a living thing seeping through her layers of clothing, its icy fingers searching for her bones. The lantern cast a tiny, dancing circle of light on the swirling snow. "Where are you?" she yelled, though she knew the wind would swallow her words. She followed the sound, a desperate beacon in the maelstrom. She stumbled, fell to her knees and pushed herself back up her lungs, burning with the frigid air. Then her light fell upon a shape, a dark mound against the suffocating white. It was a woman. She was lying face down in the snow, a brightly colored but threadbare blanket clutched on her back. Her black hair was fanned out, already crusted with ice. Willa recognized the beadwork on her deerskin moccasins. Apache. Willa knelt, her own cold, forgotten. She turned the woman over. Her face was young, her skin the color of polished copper, now tinged with a deadly blue. Her eyes were open, staring sightlessly into the storm. She was gone, but clutched to her chest, wrapped in the blanket, and sheltered by her mother's lifeless body, was the source of the cry. A baby. Its face was red and raw from the cold, and its own wails. It was so small, a tiny, fragile being against the universe's fury. As Willa watched, its cries weakened, turning into pathetic, exhausted whimpers. It was dying. In that moment, the world stood still. The wind, the cold, the dead woman, it all faded away. There was only the child. Willa knew the stories. She knew the fear and hatred that simmered between the settlers and the Apache. Taking this child was not just an act of mercy. It was an act of defiance. It was a declaration of war on the unspoken rules of this land. They would call her a traitor, an Indian lover. They might even come for her. Silas Kane, the cattle baron whose land bordered hers, would use any excuse to run her off. But then the baby's tiny, blue-tinged hand uncurled its fingers, brushing against hers. It was a touch that felt like a spark in the frozen wasteland. Thomas's voice echoed in her memory, a quiet evening by the fire. "Everyone deserves a chance to see the sunrise, Willa, no matter who they are." Her choice was made. With tears freezing on her cheeks, she gently pried the baby from its mother's arms. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to the still face, a promise and a prayer. "I'll protect your child." She wrapped the infant inside her own coat, pressing it against the warmth of her body. Turning her back on the tragic figure in the snow, she fought her way back to the cabin. The baby's life, a fragile ember, she had to shield from the storm. As she slammed the door shut, plunging the bolt home against the raging blizzard, she knew one thing for certain. The life she had known was over. A new, far more dangerous one had just begun. The warmth of the cabin was a shock after the Arctic fury outside. Willa stumbled towards the hearth, her body trembling, her mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. She gently laid the swaddled infant on the bearskin rug. Thomas had prized her hands clumsy as she unwrapped the layers. The baby was a boy. His skin was dangerously cold to the touch, and his breathing was shallow, punctuated by a rasping cough that tore at Willa's heart. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She was a homesteader, not a midwife. She knew how to mend a fence and shoot a rifle, but she knew nothing about saving a dying child. "Oh, Thomas, what have I done?" she whispered to the empty room. But there was no time for doubt. She looked at the boy's small, still face, and a fierce, primal protectiveness washed over her. She would not let him die. Her first instinct was warmth. She stripped off his damp deerskin wrappings, her hands hesitating for a moment at the intricate beadwork and the small medicine pouch tied with a leather thong around his neck. It felt like a violation, but a necessary one. She wrapped him in the softest of her own linen shifts and held him close to her own skin, covering them both with a heavy wool blanket. She sat in the rocking chair, her back to the fire, creating a cocoon of shared body heat. For hours she sat like that, rocking rhythmically, humming tuneless lullabies her own mother had sung to her. The baby was terrifyingly still, at first his life hanging by a thread. Willa could feel the cold leaching from his small body into hers. She pressed her ear to his chest, listening to the faint, fluttering heartbeat, praying with an intensity she hadn't felt since Thomas's funeral. Slowly, miraculously, a change began. The blue tint in his lips and beneath his fingernails began to recede, replaced by a healthier, if pale, hue. His breathing deepened, the rasp lessening. He stirred his tiny fists, clenching and unclenching. The next challenge was hunger. What could she feed him? She had flour, salted pork, dried beans. Nothing for an infant. Then she remembered the goat. Bessie, her stubborn, ill-tempered nanny goat, was her last living livestock. Her milk was rich. It was a risk, but she had to take it. She settled the baby, now much warmer, into a makeshift cradle she fashioned from a crate, lining it with her softest petticoats and placing it near the fire. Then she braved the short but treacherous path to the lean-to that served as a barn. The journey took her 10 minutes, fighting against the wind and snow, and when she returned, her face raw and her hands numb. She was carrying a pail with a precious cupful of warm milk. She fashioned a crude teat from a piece of clean leather, carefully dripping the milk into the baby's mouth. He choked at first, then, guided by instinct, began to suckle weakly. It was the most beautiful sight Willa had ever seen. As he drank, his dark, almond-shaped eyes opened and looked directly into hers. They were deep, ancient eyes, full of a wisdom that seemed impossible for one so young. In that gaze, Willa felt a connection, a silent understanding that transcended language and culture. For the next 2 days, as the blizzard raged on, the cabin became a sanctuary, a world unto itself. Willa's life found a new rhythm revolving entirely around the child. She fed him, she cleaned him, she kept him warm. The constant demanding presence of this new life pushed aside the spectre of her grief. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with his soft breaths and occasional strengthening cries. She found herself talking to him constantly, telling him about Thomas, about the wildflowers that grew in the meadow in spring, about the shapes she saw in the clouds. He needed a name. Calling him the baby felt wrong. She couldn't know his true name, the one his mother would have given him. So she gave him a temporary one, a name of hope. She called him Asa, an old name from a book her mother owned, meaning healer. for in saving him, he was also healing her. On the 5th morning, the wind finally died. The silence was as jarring as the previous roar had been. Willa opened the door to a world transformed. Everything was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The sun was brilliant, glinting off the snow with a blinding intensity. The air was crisp and clean. They had survived. Asa, cradled in her arms, gurgled happily at the sight of the bright light pouring into the cabin. Willa felt a surge of triumph, of pure, unadulterated joy. Her joy was short-lived. Later that day, as she was clearing a path to the woodpile, she saw him. A lone rider, silhouetted against the snow-covered ridge to the west. He wasn't moving, just watching. Even from a distance, she could tell he was a white man, a tracker, by the look of his horse and the long rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Her blood ran cold. It had to be one of Silas Kane's men. Kane, a man as rapacious as the vultures that circled his slaughter pens, had been trying to buy her out for months. He claimed her small plot was essential for his cattle empire. But Willa knew the truth. Thomas had discovered a year-round spring in the northern corner of their property, a treasure more valuable than gold in this arid land. Thomas had kept it a secret, but secrets in the West had a way of seeping out. The rider sat there for a long, unnerving hour before finally turning his horse and disappearing over the ridge. Willa's hand went to the rifle, leaning against the cabin wall. The blizzard had been a battle against nature. Now she feared the battle against man was about to begin. That night, unable to sleep, she was tidying Thomas's belongings, a ritual of remembrance she hadn't been able to perform in months. In the bottom of his old trunk, beneath his spare shirt and a worn Bible, her fingers brushed against something hard. It was a small, leather-bound journal she had never seen before. She opened it. Thomas's familiar, blocky script filled the pages. But he wasn't writing about fence posts or crop yields. He was writing about the Apache. He wrote of secret meetings of trading tobacco and flour for knowledge of the land. He wrote of a man named Taza, a warrior he respected, and of learning their paths through the mountains. And then on the last written page, a sentence that made her heart stop. They do not trust many of our kind, but they know I am a man of my word. I have given my oath to Taza that this spring, that the one they call the breath of the mountain, will remain sacred. It is their water as much as ours. Kane must never know. The spring, her spring. It was a sacred Apache site. The full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. She was harboring an Apache child on land that was sacred to his people. Land that a ruthless cattle baron would kill to possess. The tracker on the ridge was no longer a vague threat. He was a harbinger. She looked at Asa sleeping peacefully by the fire, and knew the storm had not ended. It had only just begun. The world thawed, and dripping was full of omens. A lone hawk circling over the cabin felt like a sentinel. The drip, drip, drip of melting snow from the eaves sounded like a ticking clock. 2 weeks after the blizzard, Willa's supplies were dangerously low. The goat's milk was enough for Asa, but she was down to her last handful of flour and a few strips of salted pork. A trip to the town of Prosperity was unavoidable. Leaving Asa was agony. She bundled him tightly in his cradle, placing it in the center of the room, where no stray spark from the hearth could reach him. She barricaded the door from the outside in a way she hoped looked natural, and placed Thomas's loaded Winchester right beside the cradle. "I'll be back before sundown, little one," she whispered, her voice thick with an anxiety that felt like a physical weight. You be brave." The ride to prosperity was a journey through a half-drowned world. The trail was a morass of mud and slush, and the air, though warmer, carried the damp chill of melting snow. The town itself was a study in mud and ambition. A single wide street, lined with raw lumber storefronts, it was a place fueled by silver speculation and ranching greed. Men in muddy boots and sweat-stained hats watched her as she rode, in their eyes lingering with a mixture of pity and predatory curiosity, the lone widow of Hayes Canyon. Her first stop was Miller's Mercantile. Old Man Miller, a man with a face like a dried apple, peered at her over his spectacles. "Willa, thought that blizzard might have swallowed you whole." "It tried, Mr. Miller," she said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. She handed him her list, flour, salt, coffee lamp oil, and at the bottom, a bolt of soft flannel. Miller raised an eyebrow as he measured out the flour. "Getting into sewing." "Just mending," she lied, her heart thumping. "The winter was hard on my things." As he tallied the cost, the batwing doors of the Mercantile swung open. Silas Kane entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was a man built of lard and malice, dressed in a tailored black suit that was ridiculously out of place in the muddy town. His face was perpetually florid, and his small, piggish eyes missed nothing. He was flanked by 2 men, one of whom Willa recognized with a jolt of fear. It was the tracker from the ridge. Well, Mrs. Hayes Kane's voice was smooth, like oil poured over gravel. "Good to see you survived the storm. Providence is cruel, but it seems it has spared our little dove of the canyons." "Mr. Kane." Willa said, her voice tight. She grabbed her sacks of flour. "I don't suppose the solitude has changed your mind about my generous offer for that worthless piece of rock you call a homestead?" He continued, stepping to block her path. His cheap cologne was suffocating. "My price is the same." "It's not for sale," Willa said, trying to push past him. Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Everything is for sale, Mrs. Hayes. It's just a matter of finding the right currency. Land money. Security." He let the word hang in the air. His gaze flickered to the tracker, a man with a weathered face and weary, calculating eyes. "Jedediah here was just telling me he saw some unusual tracks out your way. Apache tracks. A woman's by the look of them. Strange for one to be out there alone in a storm." Willa's blood turned to ice. She gripped her sacks tighter, her knuckles white. "The snow plays tricks on the eyes. The wind covers many things." "Indeed it does," Kane said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But it also uncovers things. A man could get into a whole heap of trouble being too hospitable to savages. The army doesn't take kindly to it. Neither do your neighbors." It was a direct threat, wrapped in a thin veneer of concern. He knew, or he suspected, which was just as dangerous. The man Jedediah watched her, his expression unreadable. There was no malice in his eyes, just a professional weariness. He was a tool, and Kane was the hand that wielded him. "I'll thank you to let me pass." "Mr. Kane." "Willa," said her voice, shaking with barely controlled rage. "I have chores to attend to." Kane chuckled and stepped aside with a mock bow. "Of course, we all have our chores." As she brushed past his tracker, Jedediah met her eyes for a fraction of a second. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of warning, or perhaps pity. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. Willa fled the mercantile, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She loaded her supplies with trembling hands and spurred her horse, not even glancing back as she galloped out of town. The ride home was fueled by terror. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered accusation. Cain's words echoed in her mind. Unusual tracks, hospitable to savages. He was circling a vulture, waiting for the kill. He wouldn't just try to force her off her land now. He would use the baby. He would paint her as a traitor and use the fear of the Apache to turn the entire territory against her. She arrived back at the cabin at dusk, her horse lathered and she herself on the verge of collapse. She burst through the door, her eyes immediately seeking the cradle. Asa was awake, his little arms batting at the air. He gurgled when he saw her, a wide, toothless smile spreading across his face. The sight of him so innocent and unaware of the danger swirling around them broke something in her. She rushed to his side, scooping him into her arms and holding him so tight he squirmed. Tears of fear and frustration streamed down her face. Later that night, with Asa sleeping soundly, she pulled out Thomas's journal again, seeking some connection to the man who had faced this land with such quiet strength. She read late into the night, the lantern light flickering, her mind racing. She read about his respect for the Apache's resilience, their knowledge of the unforgiving landscape. He wrote about Taza the warrior, not as a savage, but as a proud man, protecting his family. Taza's wife is with child. One entry read, "He is fierce with worry. Their people have suffered much. The bluecoats push them from the east, the ranchers steal their water to the west. There is nowhere left for them to be safe." The entry was dated just a month before the blizzard. A chilling realization washed over Willa. The woman in the snow. Could it have been Taza's wife? Was the child in her arms the son of the very man her husband had respected? The journal had one more secret. Tucked into a leather flap on the inside back cover was a small, crudely drawn map. It showed her homestead, the creek, and the mountains behind it. But it also showed a hidden trail, a path Thomas had marked with the Apache word for spirit Izan. It led from the back of her property, deep into the Dragoon Mountains, to a place marked only as the Hidden Camp. This was it. This was the connection Thomas had left her. It wasn't just a map. It was a lifeline. Or a fuse. She didn't know which. Suddenly the howl of a coyote split the night sharp and close. Then another answered from a different direction, and a third. But this was no coyote pack. The calls were too regular, too precise. They were signals. Willa's heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the window, peering into the moonlit darkness. She saw nothing but shadows and snow, but she knew they were there. Just as Cain's man had been watching from the ridge, someone else was watching now. The Apache had come. They did not storm the cabin. They simply appeared. One moment the moonlit snowfield behind her home was empty. The next it was occupied by a dozen silent, formidable figures on horseback. They were ghosts conjured from the moonlight, and shadows armed with rifles and a palpable aura of grief and anger. Willa stood frozen in the center of her cabin, the sleeping form of Asa clutched tightly to her chest. Her own Winchester was propped by the door, but she knew it was a fool's hope. This was not a fight she could win with a gun. For a long time, nothing happened. The warriors sat on their horses, their faces grim and unreadable in the pale light, their breath pluming in the cold air. They were watching the cabin, their stillness more terrifying than any war cry. They were waiting. At their head sat a man who radiated an authority that was both fierce and sorrowful. He was lean and powerfully built, his face a mask of chiseled granite, etched with lines of hardship and recent pain. His eyes fixed on her cabin burned with a cold fire. Willa knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was Taza. She had a choice. She could cower inside, wait for them to make the first move, and likely die in a hail of bullets and splintered wood. Or she could face them. She looked down at Asa. His life depended on the next few minutes. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she made her decision. Leaving the rifle where it was, she unbolted the door and stepped outside onto the small porch. The cold air hit her face. She held Asa protectively, making sure the blanket was wrapped securely around him. Her appearance caused a subtle shift in the riders. A low murmur passed through them. Rifles were gripped tighter. Taza's gaze narrowed, locking onto her. He saw the bundle in her arms, and his face, already a mask of grief, seemed to harden further. He dismounted in a single fluid motion and began to walk towards her, his steps deliberate and menacing. 2 other warriors dismounted and fanned out behind him, their rifles held at the ready. Willa's heart hammered so hard she thought it would break through her ribs. She stood her ground, her body trembling but her resolve firm. She would not show fear. She would not look like a thief. Taza stopped 10 feet from the porch. He was even more intimidating up close. The grief in his eyes was a raw, open wound, but beneath it was a warrior's deadly focus. He said nothing, simply staring at her, his eyes flicking from her face to the bundle she held. The silence stretched thin and taut. Finally, Willa found her voice speaking clearly and steadily into the frozen air. "Your wife was a brave woman," she said. The words were simple, inadequate, but they were the only truth she had to offer. She saved her son's life with her own. "I found them in the storm. She was already gone." Taza's expression did not change, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. His eyes burned into hers, searching for a lie. "I brought him in." Willa continued, her voice gaining strength. "I kept him warm. I fed him. I have tried to honor the spirit of his mother." One of the warriors behind Taza spat a single harsh word in Apache. Willa didn't need to understand the language to know its meaning. Liar. Taza held up a hand, silencing the man. He took another slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the bundle. "You steal our children," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, the core of a grievance that had cost hundreds of lives on both sides. "No," Willa said, shaking her head. "I saved him. He would have frozen to death within minutes." As if on cue, Asa stirred in her arms. He let out a small, sleepy cry, a sound of contentment, not distress. He wriggled, pushing his head out from the blanket. His dark, curious eyes blinked in the moonlight. He saw the tall, imposing figure of his father, and for a moment, he was still. Then a look of recognition, faint and instinctual, crossed his infant features. He made a soft gurgling sound and lifted a tiny hand, reaching towards Taza. It was the turning point. The sight of his son alive, healthy, and clearly unafraid shattered Taza's icy composure. The mask of the implacable warrior cracked, revealing the grieving father beneath. A choked gasp of pain and relief escaped his lips. The tension in his shoulders eased, and the fire in his eyes softened to a smoldering ember of sorrow. He looked from Asa's face to Willa's, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw not a thief, but a woman alone, and surrounded by armed men who had not flinched. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes. He saw the genuine care with which she held his son. His name, Taza, said his voice rough with emotion. His name is Nodin. It means wind, for he was born in the great storm. I have been calling him Asa Willa, confessed quietly. It means healer. Taza nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He took the final steps forward until he was standing right before her. He did not reach for the child. Instead, he reached out and gently touched the small medicine pouch still tied around Nodin's neck. His fingers lingered on it, a silent communion with his lost wife. My wife, Chilale. Her hands made this, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It holds a piece of the sacred turquoise from the mountain to protect him. He looked back at Willa. It seems her spirit guided him to you. At that moment, from the ranks of the warriors, an older man with a face like a wrinkled map stepped forward. He spoke in the Apache tongue, his voice raspy but full of authority. Taza listened, then translated for Willa. Our shaman Goklaya says you have the heart of a mother, but the spirit of a warrior. He says you stood against the storm, and you stood against us all to protect a child that was not your own. Taza paused, his gaze intense. He says a woman who can command the spirits of winter and face down warriors to save a child is no ordinary woman. She is an Izanma. What does that mean? Willa asked. It means, Spirit Mother Taza replied. The name settled in the air, imbued with a power and significance that Willa could feel deep in her soul. The standoff was over. The immediate threat had passed. But as Taza finally reached out and took his son into his arms, holding him with a desperate, tender reverence, Willa saw the new, more complex reality of her situation. Taza looked at the cabin, his eyes lingering on the well-tended hearth and the sturdy walls. This land you live on, Taza said, his voice once again, holding a note of guardedness. This cabin, it stands by the breath of the mountain, the sacred spring. Willa's heart skipped a beat. She nodded, remembering Thomas's journal. My husband, Thomas, he knew. He respected it. He gave his word it would be protected. Taza's eyes narrowed slightly. Thomas Hayes. I knew him. He was a man of honor, a rare thing. He looked from Willa back to the sleeping face of his son. But honor dies with men. A new man, a cattle chief, Silas Kane, he seeks to possess this land. He does not have honor. He will desecrate the spring and destroy all in his path to get it. He looked directly at Willa. And now he knows that you shelter an Apache child. He will use that against you. He will use my son to start a war. The fragile peace of the moment evaporated, replaced by the cold certainty of a shared enemy. They were no longer just a warrior and a widow. They were two parents from two different worlds, bound by the love for a child and a threat that could destroy them both. News in the West traveled on currents of dust and whiskey, and Silas Kane was a master of manipulating both. He didn't need proof of the Apache child in Willa's cabin. He only needed the rumor. Within days, the story had twisted and festered, taking on a life of its own in the saloons and boarding houses of prosperity. Willa Hayes wasn't just a widow harboring a savage, the story went. She was a collaborator, a race traitor who had guided the Apache war party to her land. The child wasn't a helpless infant she'd found. It was a white captive, a stolen settler baby the Apache were holding for ransom in her cabin, with her full complicity. Kane fanned the flames with practiced ease. He bought round after round of drinks at the Silver Spur Saloon, his voice booming with righteous indignation. "This woman enjoys the protection of this town of the U.S. Army. And how does she repay us?" He'd thunder, slamming his fist on the bar. "She consorts with the very devils who raided the Miller homestead last spring, the very butchers who killed innocent women and children." He was lying that raid had been the work of bandits from Mexico. But in the volatile atmosphere of fear and prejudice, his words were gospel. He painted a picture of an imminent threat of war parties gathering in the Dragoon Mountains, using Willa's cabin as their foothold. His true goal, the sacred spring on her land, was never mentioned. He was wrapping his greed in the flag of public safety. His tracker, Jedediah, watched these performances with a growing sense of unease. Jedediah was a pragmatic man, not a malicious one. He worked for Kane because the pay was good and the work was steady. He tracked what Kane told him to track and reported what he saw. He had reported the truth: a lone woman, a baby, and later an Apache party that did not act aggressively. But he saw how Kane twisted that truth into a weapon. One evening, Kane summoned Jedediah to his opulent office at the back of his cattle company headquarters. The room was filled with plush leather chairs, a mahogany desk, and the mounted heads of elk and mountain lions, their glass eyes staring blankly. "Jedediah, my friend," Kane said, pouring 2 glasses of expensive brandy. "You've been quiet lately." "Just listening," Jedediah replied, taking the glass but not drinking. "The time for listening is over. The time for action is now," Kane said, his eyes gleaming. "The good people of this territory are terrified. They look to me for leadership. I've petitioned the territorial governor, but he's a slow-moving fool. We need to force his hand." "What do you have in mind, Mr. Kane?" Kane leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "War is a messy business. But sometimes a little mess is necessary to clean things up. The final piece of the puzzle is the child." Jedediah remained silent, his weathered face impassive. "As long as that Apache brat is with the woman, it's a standoff," Kane explained. "But if that child were to be rescued, brought back to town as proof of Apache savagery and her treachery, well, that would change everything. It would ignite a fire that not even the governor could put out. The army would have to move in, clear the mountains for good, and the land would be open. Safe." "You want me to steal the baby?" Jedediah said flatly. "I prefer the term liberate a captive," Kane corrected with a slick smile. "You're the best tracker in this territory. You can get in and out of that cabin without her ever knowing what happened. Bring the child to me. I'll handle the rest." Jedediah stared into his brandy. He had done many things for money in his life. He had hunted men and animals. He had bent the law and looked the other way. But kidnapping an infant from a woman who, as far as he could tell, had done nothing but show kindness that felt different. It crossed a line he hadn't realized he possessed. He remembered the look in Willa Hayes's eyes when Kane had threatened her in the mercantile. It wasn't the look of a traitor. It was the look of a cornered animal protecting its young. "The Apache won't take kindly to that," Jedediah said, testing the waters. "That warrior Taza, he's the boy's father. He's Cochise's bloodline. Stealing his son is like kicking a hornet's nest the size of a mountain." "Exactly." Kane beamed, misinterpreting Jedediah's warning as strategic thinking. "That's the point. We want them to retaliate. A small, foolish raid on the town is precisely what we need. It will prove my point and seal their fate, and our future prosperity." Jedediah stood up, placing the untouched glass of brandy on the desk. "I track animals and men, Mr. Kane. I don't steal babies." Kane's face darkened, the jovial mask falling away to reveal the raw ambition beneath. "Is that so? That's a disappointing turn of loyalty, Jedediah. Especially for a man who values his steady employment. There are other men who are not so sentimental. Men who understand that progress requires sacrifice." The threat was clear. Jedediah's position, his reputation, his very livelihood in this territory depended on Kane's goodwill. He had seen what happened to men who crossed Silas Kane. They ended up broke or run out of the territory or face down in a shallow grave. "Think carefully about your next words, my friend." Kane said, his voice dangerously soft. Jedediah looked at the man he had worked for, at the greedy, self-satisfied look on his face, and then he thought of the woman in the cabin and the child whose only crime was being born. He had spent his life on the fringes, guided by a simple code of survival. But Kane was asking him to betray something more fundamental. "I reckon my words are what they are," Jedediah said slowly, his hand moving almost unconsciously to rest on the butt of his pistol. "You'll have to find someone else for this job." He turned and walked out of the office, the weight of Kane's furious gaze on his back. He knew he hadn't just quit a job. He had made a powerful enemy. As he stepped out into the muddy street, he knew two things for certain. Kane would not be deterred, and the woman and the child were in more danger now than ever before. He had to warn her. But first he had to outrun whatever Kane would send after him. The betrayal came under the cloak of a moonless night. Kane, enraged by Jedediah's insubordination, had hired two hard-faced men from the saloon brothers named Caleb and Finn, known for their lack of scruples and their thirst for whiskey and violence. He didn't need Jedediah's stealth. He just needed the job done. Willa had fallen into a new routine, one of cautious vigilance. During the day she worked her homestead, always keeping an eye on the ridges, always keeping Asa close. At night, she barricaded the door and slept lightly the Winchester by her side. She had seen no sign of Taza or his warriors, but she felt their presence, a protective watchfulness from the mountains she couldn't see. It was Kane's men she feared. Her mistake was exhaustion. A full day of mending the corral fence had left her bone-weary. After putting Asa to sleep in his cradle, she had sat in her rocking chair, intending to rest her eyes for just a moment. She woke with a start. Hours later, the fire burned down to embers. The cabin was cold and silent, too silent. A primal scream of terror clawed at her throat. She leaped to the cradle. It was empty. The blanket was tossed aside. The small indentation where his head had rested was still there, but Asa was gone. "No," she whispered the word, a breathless plea. She scrambled to the door. The bar was still in place. The windows were latched. How? Then she saw it. A section of the floorboards near the rear wall, where the wood was softest, had been pried up from below. They had tunneled under the cabin like rats. They had taken him while she slept mere feet away. A wave of self-loathing and panic so intense it made her physically sick washed over her. She had failed him. She had failed his mother. She had failed Taza. She stumbled outside, screaming his name into the uncaring darkness, her voice raw with hysteria. Aese Nodin. There was no reply, but the echo of her own despair. She collapsed to her knees, her body racked with sobs. It was over. Cain had won. He had her son. But as she knelt there broken, a new feeling began to smoulder through the grief rage. A white-hot, furious rage that burned away her tears and her fear. Silas Cain had taken her child. He thought he had broken the lonely widow. He had no idea what he had truly unleashed. He had created a mother with nothing left to lose. Her mind cleared, becoming sharp and focused. Hysteria wouldn't save Nodin. She needed a plan. Going to the town for help was useless. Cain owned the town. The lawman was in his pocket. Her only allies were in the mountains. She had to reach Taza. She remembered the map in Thomas's journal. The secret Izan trail. It was her only hope. She worked with a feverish intensity, throwing a saddle on her horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dusty. She stuffed a loaf of bread and a canteen of water into a saddlebag. She took her rifle, checking the load, and Thomas's old Colt revolver, tucking it into the waistband of her trousers. She was no longer just a homesteader. She was going to war. She didn't take the main path. She rode to the back of her property, to the thicket of manzanita and juniper, where Thomas's map indicated the trail began. She found the marker he'd described, 3 flat stones stacked atop one another, and plunged into the wilderness. The trail was little more than a whisper of a path, overgrown and treacherous in the dark. It clung to the sides of steep ravines and wound through dense forests of pine and oak. More than once, Dusty stumbled, and Willa had to dismount and lead him through the treacherous terrain. The night was alive with sounds. The snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, and every shadow seemed to hold a lurking danger. But Willa's fear had been cauterized. There was only the mission. As the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of grey and pink, she heard a sound that made her freeze. A low groan from somewhere off the trail ahead. She dismounted, tying Dusty to a low-hanging branch, and crept forward, rifle in hand. Lying at the base of a large ponderosa pine was a man. He was clutching his side, his shirt stained dark with blood. It was Jedediah the tracker. Her first instinct was to raise her rifle. He was one of them, but he was alone and clearly wounded. He looked up, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "Mrs. Hayes," he rasped, his voice weak. "Knew you'd take this path. It's the smart way." "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice cold as steel. "Where is my son Cain's men?" 2 brothers, Caleb and Finn Jedediah, coughed a fleck of blood on his lips. "I tried to stop them. Figured Cain would send someone else after I refused him. I wasn't fast enough. They took the boy. I followed." He explained in short, pained sentences. He had ambushed the brothers on the trail, trying to get Nodin back. He had managed to knock out Caleb, the bigger one. But Finn had shot him in the side before riding off with the baby, heading back towards prosperity. He's taking him to Cain. Jedediah finished, his breath shallow. "They'll use him to start the war Taza warned you about." Willa looked at the man who had worked for her enemy, now bleeding in the dirt for trying to save her son. The lines of allegiance in the West were never straight. Why, she asked. Why help me? Jedediah managed a weak, grim smile. "Been on the wrong side of things for a long time, ma'am. Figured it was time I tried the right one." Besides, he winced in pain. "I don't steal babies." She made a quick decision. She couldn't leave him to die. She used her canteen to clean his wound as best she could and tore a strip from her petticoat to make a pressure bandage. It was a nasty wound, but the bullet seemed to have gone clean through. "Can you ride?" she asked. "If I have to." He grunted. "You don't," a voice said from the trees. Tarza and 3 of his warriors emerged from the forest as silently as the morning mist. They had been tracking her, watching her. Tarza's eyes took in the scene, Willa tending to the wounded white man, her face set with grim determination. He looked at her, and his gaze was filled with a profound respect. She had not waited to be rescued. She had acted. "He is gone." Willa said the words catching in her throat. "Cain has him." Tarza's face became a thundercloud. He listened as Jedediah, despite his pain, recounted the story again. When he was finished, Tarza knelt beside him. He examined the wound with a practiced eye. "You fought for my son," he said to Jedediah. It was not a question. Jedediah nodded. "I did." Tarza looked at one of his warriors and spoke in Apache. The warrior nodded and helped Jedediah to his feet, treating him not as an enemy, but as a wounded ally. Tarza turned his attention back to Willa. The time for grief was over. The time for retribution was here. "You have the heart of a she-bear fighting for her cub Izanma," he said, using the name they had given her. "Now we will show Silas Cain what happens when he steals from our den." He gave a sharp command. One of his warriors brought her a fresh horse, a wiry Apache pony, that seemed to dance with nervous energy. It was faster and more sure-footed than her own Dusty. "Ride with me." "Spirit." "Mother." Tarza commanded, his voice ringing with the promise of vengeance. "We will bring our son home, and we will bring the thunder with us." As they rode, a war party materializing from the canyons to join them, Willa was no longer a widow from Ohio lost in the wilderness. She was a woman transformed by fire and ice, riding alongside a warrior chief, a mother on her way to reclaim her child, ready to unleash a storm of her own. Silas Cain, flush with victory, paraded the terrified Nodin through prosperity. "Here is the proof," he roared to the gathered crowd. "A white child stolen by savages." The lie, audacious and monstrous, took root. Fueled by fear and whiskey, a posse of 30 men formed ready to follow Cain to cleanse the mountains. They galloped out of town, a furious mob riding directly into a trap. Guided by Jedediah's knowledge of Cain's pride, Tarza and Willa had chosen their ground. Serpent's Creek, a narrow box canyon with only one escape route. As Cain's posse thundered into the dusty wash, Apache warriors triggered a prepared rock slide, sealing the entrance behind them. The trap was sprung. The posse pulled up short in a cloud of dust and panic, enclosed by inescapable stone walls. From the far end of the canyon, Tarza emerged on his horse, holding a calm Nodin in his arms. Cain stared, his face a mask of disbelief. "Men, look! He has the captive!" he screamed desperately, trying to cling to his narrative. "He has his son!" A voice cut through the canyon, clear and strong. Willa Hayes stepped out from behind a rock formation. Thomas's revolver held steadily at her side. She ignored Cain, her eyes fixed on the men of the posse. "His name is Nodin," she announced, her voice echoing off the rock walls. "He is an Apache child. His mother died in the Great Blizzard, and I saved him. The only liar here is Silas Cain." She pointed at the cattle baron. "He doesn't care about your safety. He wants the sacred spring on my land for his cattle. He sent his men to steal a baby from my home. Is that the act of a leader or a coward and a thief? The truth, simple and powerful, shattered the posse's righteous fury. They looked from the calm Apache father and child to the resolute woman they had misjudged, to the frantic, sweating face of Storm Kane. The lie was exposed. One by one they lowered their rifles, the anger on their faces turning from the Apache to the man who had so completely used them. Kane was alone, his authority disintegrated. Taza rode forward and gently past Nodin into Willa's waiting arms. The reunion was quiet, a moment of pure relief that sealed Kane's defeat. Taza then faced the disgraced Baron. "You seek war, but you are not a warrior," he said, his voice cold with contempt. "You will walk back to prosperity. You will leave this territory and never return. If you are ever seen in these mountains again, our justice will be swift." He turned his back on him, the ultimate insult. Silas Kane, the vulture of prosperity, was left to his humiliating solitary walk of shame, his power broken forever. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over the land, earned not by bloodshed, but by courage and truth. Willa Hayes was no longer just a widow. She was Izan, the spirit mother, a bridge between two worlds. She had faced the untamed West and found not only her own strength, but a family, a purpose and a legacy that would be whispered on the wind for generations to come. The story of Willa Hayes, the spirit mother, is more than just a tool of survival against the odds. It's a powerful reminder that the deepest bonds are often forged in the harshest of circumstances. It shows us that motherhood is not defined by blood, but by the courage to protect, the compassion to heal, and the willingness to fight for a future that is better than the past. Willa's journey from a grieving widow to a respected legend illustrates how one person's act of kindness can build a bridge between worlds and change the course of history for an entire community. Her legacy and that of the warrior Taza reminds us that true strength is found not in division and hatred, but in understanding honor and the shared love for a child. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and the birth of an unlikely family in the heart of the Wild West moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true life tales from the untamed American frontier. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive.